are Cosy Science. We are Ale, Natalie, Mario, and Mitch at the camera. And most of the faces I now recognize, which is nice. But for those who do not know, usually we are a group who is committed to bring science to non-scientists, scientists from the field and not from the field. And we have different topics every last Tuesday of the month. Always here in the city of York. And tonight is a special one, so I don't know how deep you'll get into science. But we have Chiara here, our speaker, who is going to talk about art and science. And Ale is going to tell the details.
Yeah, in fact, tonight is going to be a little bit different because we don't have a scientist, but we have a philosopher of science. She's a lecturer in History and Philosophy of Science at UCL, at the Department of Science and Technology Studies. And she's always been interested and she works on general history and philosophy of science, especially on visual culture and the relationship between art and science. In concrete, for instance, she has done for her PhD thesis, she's trying to understand which was the influence of science and technology on Picasso's in his masterpiece Guernica. So we are really looking forward to listen her talk tonight about the correlation between art and science.
I just forgot to tell you, or maybe I had a bit too much wine. But how the evening is going to work is that Chiara is going to talk roughly about 20 to 30 minutes, is that right? About her topic, and then we have a little break where Mario has designed a little game. We distribute the game, it's difficult as usual. And in exchange we ask for a few donations for a present for the speaker, for like travel expenses for some speakers and to run it because the Science Cafe is run by you. Additionally, we are lucky tonight because the City of York is going to sponsor a few sandwiches in the break. So for those who are hungry, you don't have to start for too long. Yeah, and now we can listen to the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yes, there is a sense in which there is very little practical science in what I'm going to say today, but there is a lot of thinking about science in what I want to do, and a lot of broad thinking about what science connects to and whether it's a good thing to think about the connections that science has with other things. And my angle is going to be philosophical. I'm going to try to behave and not to go too philosophical. I've got my friend Paula, who is an artist, who is already looking at me, going like, I'll see through the bullshit. So, so I'll try to behave. But what I'm trying to work on, which is something which I'm very fond of, is actually looking at the connections between art and science. I've done quite a lot of work at the philosophical level on what it means to represent, and clearly the idea of representing is something which is common between art and science. Scientists make models, and they have sometimes aesthetic criteria for producing those models. They have practical, functional criteria for producing models. You hear a lot of physicists talking about beautiful equations, or mathematicians. And similarly, artists have obviously deal with the practice of representing on a daily basis. But what I want to do today is actually take a slightly polemical angle on that. So whenever I say I work on art and science, everybody says, oh, Leonardo da Vinci, okay? And that is one of the, obviously, probably the epitome of the integration of artistic and scientific practice. I'm not going to look into that so much today. What I want to look at is what is there to gain in thinking about and in trying to force, actually, artists and scientists to collaborate a little bit more. I'm often asked to give opinions on what we now call artist in residence programs. Some people might be familiar with the concept. It's this idea that scientific institutions tend to hire an artist for some kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. And what tends to happen quite often is that the role of the artist in those collaborations is perceived as, let's illustrate the science for the purpose of science communication. And that's about it. And I think there is a lot more that we can actually do with this kind of artist in residence programs, and that we should actually push for a different kind of collaboration, possibly a critical one, and possibly even a conflictual one. But I'll tell you more about this in due course. For one thing, and that's where I want to start, I'm going to look at 3 case studies. One is relatively old, one is slightly more end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and one is a contemporary case study. So for one thing, I want to start with this idea that we think that an artist in residence program or that an art and science collaboration is quite a recent thing, it's quite a hot topic. But in fact, if we believe that, we are just reinventing the wheel. Because artist and scientist collaborations are actually things that were happening quite a long time ago, and I will just start from, if you could share pictures, so I've prepared some images that you can sort of work with, but they are probably not enough, so if you work in groups, that's probably... So I want to start from essentially history, and I want, this is a slightly different one, but it's the same kind of picture just from the back. So we think that this idea of artists and scientists working together makes for the kind of big deal about interdisciplinarity, which is a very, very contemporary hot topic. But in fact, if we look backwards, the history tells us that this has always been the case. And this is one of my favorite case studies. It is an image taken from an anatomical atlas. So people were studying anatomy in this way. You might find that the study of anatomy from these plates might have been slightly distracting because obviously of the interplay between what you see in the foreground and what you obviously see in the background. And there is a story about this picture. So this is an atlas which was put together by an anatomist called Bernard Siegfried Albenus. The date is about 1747, 1749. If you want to access original copies, just email the Wellcome Collections that have the original copies of this atlas, and they are really big and quite impressive. So what was going on there is that this image really condenses a lot of the kind of values that we're getting into, that were sort of permeating scientific anatomical representations at the time. What you see in the foreground, in fact, is not an individual skeleton, it's not a particular person, but in fact it is an idealization from the most perfect bits of many different skeletons. And so what Albinus was following was a criterion that was very much guiding artistic representation, scientific representations in the 18th century. And it was, we will not observe, we will not reproduce nature in its details. What we will do is we will find the best pattern in nature. And that's exactly what Albinus says about the skeleton that you see in this picture. It says it is definitely, it's not too tall, it's not too short, it's definitely not a woman, because women at the time just didn't qualify for anatomical illustration. I was looking for the best pattern in nature, and I selected it from many individual instances. And it's this kind of idea of observing individuals and then generalizing, which is very much the hallmark of anatomical representation, especially in the 18th century. Now, this is the kind of standard, very well-known side of this story. what is not known in this story is that that is not an image produced by the scientist, although in the 18th century a lot of scientists were producing their own illustrations. So Albinus was in fact able to